So, for today's goals, we have first, define retention. We're going to break down the definition of retention. Language is so very important. It is a telltale sign psychologically, sociologically, of where a person or a topic is, where that person falls in a topic. Why it exists and how it is used. Implications for these age groups: K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. Now I broke them down in this way because many schools follow this format. However, your school may have a different format because their schools may be aligned differently. Some schools will do K to 3 for the information I'm about to give. It may go K to 4, K to 5. Some middle schools are only grades 7 and 8. Some junior highs are grades 7 to 9. Okay, but your standard is 6 to 8, and then you have grades 9 to 12. Some school systems, it may only be grades 10 to 12. So take the overall information and apply it to your school. Next, pros and cons of retention. There has been a lot of research done over the centuries, and most of the data is against retention, but there is more and more data that's going for retention. Okay? Next, our goal is to inform you what should a family do when faced with retention, or what should a teacher do when faced with retention? And that's retention of a student in the teacher's class, not the retention of the teacher, him or herself. Okay, and deciding factors. What should educators and families be aware of when they're deciding whether or not retention is right for a particular child? And last but not least, next steps. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to look at the definition of retention. And as I said, language is a telltale sign of what a topic really is saying. Okay? So for the first part of the definition, according to dictionary.com, retention is the act of retaining. Now I know your teachers have told you never define a word using a form of the word. So we're going to break down the word retaining. To keep possession of. To keep possession of. To use, practice. To continue to hold or have. To hold in place or position. So there's nothing about retaining someone educationally that is positive by definition. This is to hold someone down. When I read this definition of retention, it reminds me of suppression. It reminds me of oppression. You're holding and forcing someone down. And oddly enough, with social suppression and oppression and political and economic, people always have used the idea that it's for the natives or the others' own good. So if you think about a child, sometimes people are thinking it's for his or her own good. And they use those same psychological, they use those same psychological thinkings based upon their ideas of the child. Okay. Next is the state of being retained. So your child or the child in your class is in this state. They're being held down, held in position. Okay, now this is what's really interesting in terms of retention. The power to retain. Capacity for retaining. This is one of the powers that educators have to say whether or not a child is retained, whether they're held back, whether they're held down or not, whether they're kept in position or not, and also sometimes even parents. Okay? Next. Now, what's interesting is the synonyms in dictionary.com for the definition of retention. Let's check them out. Withholding, detention, detainment, holding, and confinement. These are all synonymous with retention. Again, none of these words that are synonymous with retention are positive. They're all negative. And not only are they negative, these are typically all punitive words. These are words that we use when we penalize someone for not doing the right thing. So is retention really in the best interest of a child? Or is it punishment for not doing X, Y, and Z? Okay, we're going to get more into it. Because we are going to look at the pros. Okay, next. Now, retention background. How is it being used? Now, grade retention is widely used as a policy tool. And if you think about the trickle-down effect, states are typically in charge of education, and they give the authority to the local governments. So the state has probably a state board, and it has policies and procedures, and they do discuss retention. And then the local governments, in terms of the local board of eds, or if it's a private school or charter school, their managing group will decide what their retention policy is. And they want that retention policy in place so they can make sure from the top, wherever their top is, that they are providing certain standards to ensure that they are educating the kids in that particular institution. And they want to hold the adults accountable, and then the adults are holding the kids accountable to make sure that they have adhered to those standards. Okay? So it's a little bit of a trickle-down effect. And this is basically policy, and it's a policy tool. Next. Its relationship to academic achievement and high school completion has been the subject of scholarly research for over a century, as I mentioned before. So this is something that has been studied. Okay. The practice is increasingly part of a state's accountability system. So that's what I was essentially saying before. The states are holding the local governments and Board of Eds accountable. The Board of Eds are holding the school officials accountable. School officials are holding teachers accountable. Teachers are holding students accountable, and parents simultaneously. And along with dropout rates and test scores, your retention rate can indicate how well a school or a child is doing academically. So now, let's look at the implications and the hows or the reasons why students are retained in grades K through 2. Now, K through 2, these are very important years. These are the basic building blocks, the formations, the basic building blocks, the foundation of their education. So basically, most schools in these grade groups go by reading levels and math scores. So your reading level is your fluency, how fast you can read, how many errors you make when you read, your comprehension, and in certain levels, the comprehension questions, excuse me, they become increasingly harder. Okay? And so these grades, the kids are learning to read. So this is a very important aspect of elementary school. And then, of course, the math scores. How well does a student know the math facts? Because, of course, math is going to get increasingly harder and harder. So they need a solid foundation to make sure that they're going to be able to understand and apply basic concepts later on in the higher grades. Next. If your child is below grade level in reading or math, then that child may have trouble doing some of the academic work as the work becomes progressively hard. And so when it comes to them moving on to the next grade, a lot of schools will say, Johnny or Betsy is not ready. You have to be very careful when it comes to a student that has made no movement, no progress on their reading or math scores. If they've made no movement, there can be an indication that something is amiss with that student's mental capacity in order to do the work. And so that student should be flagged, and they should be pulled into some type of remediation to make sure that a teacher who is working one-on-one and giving him or her extra practice throughout the school week can see and can help that student move along. So if your child has not made any movement from September to December, they should be flagged. And this is how some students fall through the cracks. So you got to make sure, parents and educators, you watch out for that. And don't expect for the reading specialists, the reading administrators to flag it for you, even if that's a part of the school's process. Sometimes they're overwhelmed, especially in inner city schools where you have so many students who fall into these categories and they're overwhelmed. You really have to be able to flag it for them. Send them a quick email. Hey, I'm really concerned about Johnny or Betsy. They have made no movement from da-da-da. Can you give me some tips? Just so that it's in writing and you flagged it. The student is below proficiency in grade level math facts and skills. So the same thing that we've been talking about. Then we have grades 3 to 5. In grade 3, theoretically, a student is now not learning to read, they're reading to learn. So they have all of the basic skills that they need in order to excel in all of the subject areas from this point on. So if your child is in grade 3, and they're below grade level in grade 2, then they're going to be significantly behind the other students and are going to have to play catch up. So we see across the United States that a lot of students are retained in grade 3. The coursework gets much more involved and significantly harder than in the lower grades. So this is what we need to watch out for. They're still going to use reading levels, math scores, but now they're adding in averages to these grades. And this is why the stakes are getting higher. So of course they're going to look at whether or not your child is below grade level or not. And if I didn't say it before, and I didn't, each aspect of the school year, they increase where a child should be in terms of grade level expectancy. So at the beginning of second grade, it's going to be different than in January of second grade. And February of second grade is going to be different than in May of second grade. Okay? And so when you move up to the next grade level, of course, that level, the threshold is going, the benchmark is going to be increased. So if your child is below grade level, they're going to take that into consideration with retention. Have made no movement and below grade level in either reading or math. Go ahead. Below proficiency in grade level math, facts, and skills. Here's where the averages come in. Their work productivity, that average in the passing range. So for each school is different. Typically, historically, passing range has been 60 and higher. A lot of schools, because our schools have not internationally produced top-rated, top-notch scholars as it had in the past, now they're increasing the rigor and they're making the threshold at 70%. So, look into your district, your school's standards for what is passing. So if their work productivity, so if they get, let's say, 30 assignments in a marking period for reading, and their score was a 79, their average was a 79, of course that's passing. But what if they did not complete 3 assignments, and so they were allotted a 0 for each of those assignments? That significantly brings their average down. And these are little babies essentially in 3rd grade. They don't know about averages. So how can they understand how this is going to help them be retained? So you really have to know your school's policy and when averages come into effect. Some schools wean the average part in and take it into consideration, and some schools is boom. Yes, we're doing averages, and that's what we're going to go by and take these other things into consideration. Okay? So know your school's policy. Okay, next we have grades 6 through 8. So we have a lot of students who can be tracked to drop out of school because the standards get even higher. Okay? First, the title, they consider reading levels, math scores, and averages. But it gets a little bit, more difficult in middle school range, because now you're introducing multiple classes and multiple teachers. Okay. Now their work productivity is going to be averaged in each class by each teacher. So before you had 30 assignments in reading, but you had that one teacher. Now you have your reading teacher, you might have a writing teacher, you might have a science teacher, you might have a social studies teacher, you might have, a teacher for every subject. And all of them are averaging, and they might have different standards for averages. So it becomes very confusing for students in terms of their productivity. A student in English could be just as productive as they are in social studies, but because those teachers have different ways of teaching, passing out assignments, how many assignments, when they're due, all of what the assignments comprise of, how long they have to do the assignments, the interest level. There's so many different things that go into different ways in which teachers teach. It goes into their grade, and it can become very confusing. Kids end up not performing well in middle school, but they did fine in elementary school because of this. Also, they introduced you need to pass a fixed number of classes in order to pass. And strangely enough, the reason why our country is not doing well in STEM, the sciences, and the maths, is because it's in middle school where math gets harder, and because they can fail one class. If someone is not naturally good at math, a lot of them go ahead and give up and say, well, that's the class I'm going to fail. They'll also take into consideration reading levels and standardized test scores when they're looking at retention. Okay, so next we have grades 9 through 12. So again, in grade 9, we can track who's going to drop out, who's going to jail, who's going to college based upon their performance. Okay? The standards get very difficult. Kids have more freedoms, they have more choices, and it becomes much more difficult. So let's see how typically they use, how they decide on who's going to be retained in high school. It's by credits and mandatory courses. So this is totally different. Students have been trained to think one way, and then it shifts. And they only mention it like in an orientation, right? They don't really embed it into the everyday language of the school. So then in one class, they have 15 assignments. In another class, they have 40 assignments. In another class, they have 20 assignments. Okay? So it becomes a lot more confusing. Okay. And then each class is assigned a credit number. So if you don't pass a class, you don't get a credit. Then they have mandatory classes. So they may have 4 years of English that you have to take, and all of those classes are mandatory. Then you have, let's say, 3 years of math you have to take. All of those are mandatory, even though you may have a choice in which math you take to satisfy that math credit. You have to have 3 years of math. So some schools are going to be 2 years of math, so forth and so on. So again, apply the information how it is. Apply this basic information based upon your school standards. Okay, you have to take PE 1 semester, 1 year, 2 years, whatever the standards are. Okay, so if, let's say, you have enough credits when you're a senior at the end of the year, but you're missing, you failed one of the English classes, you don't graduate. Okay, so this is something brand new that they're adding into the mix that kids had no idea of. It's mentioned in orientation, it's in the student handbook, but it's not a part of the everyday language, and it becomes really confusing for some students. Attendance. This is really huge in high school. So your attendance can be absences, cuts, and or tardies. So let's say your district has 15 absences per school year. Some school districts and schools, they break it down to how many per marking period or how many per semester. Okay? Sometimes cuts are even more punitive than regular absence. So if you are absent from school all day, all of your classes, that's 1 absence, right? Let's say you went to school, you went to all your classes except for 1 math class. A friend of yours or a friend of a child was crying in the bathroom and they were trying to assist them. They had no permission, they had no pass, and then they went on to the next class. That's a cut because they had no permission, right? And so a lot of schools will say, well, if you cut a class 2 times, 3 times, boom, you've lost credit in that course. Okay? So they're not counting this towards the 10, 12, 15, 20 absences they have for the year. This is more punitive. Okay? Mention it in orientation. It's in the handbook, but it's not a part of the everyday language. And then tardies. Many systems have a policy that if you're tardy for a class 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, it counts as an absence. So now your tardies are accumulating and they're adding to your absences. So let's say you have PE first period and you come to the school late every single day. All of those tardies are going to add up to absences, and then you're going to end up losing absence in PE. But PE, you have excuse me, a 1 year. It's a mandatory course that you have to take in order to graduate. So if you get all these tardies, because you're just not a morning person, and it's a real thing, people, and it adds to your absences, you lose credit in PE. So all the work that you have done has gone down the drain. So you see how now it's becoming increasingly difficult, and this is why we lose so many students. Now, according to gradeschools.org, we're going to go over the pros and the cons of retention. There's not many. Okay? So, a child has significant struggles making progress in reading, writing, or math. Now, the reason why they have reading, writing, and math up here is because these subjects are the foundations and they transcend into the sciences, the social sciences, health class, art class, so forth and so on. He or she fails to reach performance levels expected for promotion to the next grade. He or she appears to be immature and young for her age. These are the standard reasons for retention. Okay? Now, the theory is that another year is going to help him or her make progress in their subjects. Being able to pass the performance levels expected for promotion the next year. And that other year is going to help him or her mature. Okay, so let's look at the cons. Woo. Okay, first, academic achievement of kids who are retained is poorer than that of peers who are promoted. Achievement gains associated with retention fade within 2 or 3 years after the grade is repeated. So people who have been retained may see increase that year, maybe even the year after, but within 2 to 3 years, their progress has stifled. Kids who are identified as most behind are the ones most likely harmed by retention. Retention often is associated with increased behavior problems. So if you think about the sociology of retention, many kids end up having behavior problems. They've already learned that stuff, the same things, because the standards typically don't change from year to year. And if the child ends up being retained in a year in which the standards do change, okay. But for the most part, most kids who are retained are doing the same academic work. So now they're bored. And now their behavior problem. Or their behaviors have increased. Grade retention has a negative impact on all areas of a child's achievement: reading, math, and language. And social emotional adjustment, peer relationships, self-esteem, behavior, problem behaviors, and attendance. So again, through the data over the years, tracing students who have been retained, we have seen this happen over and over again. And this phenomenon, the cons, are really concentrated, guess where? The inner city. Okay? Where a lot of immigrants, brown, people of color are educated. Okay, the cons list continue because there's more cons than there are pros. Students who are retained are more likely to drop out of school compared to students who were never retained. In fact, grade retention is one of the most powerful predictors of high school dropout. And again, high school dropout rate is extremely high in the United States and especially in the inner city. And so when we think about us being a powerful nation, we are as powerful as our country's citizens. So if we're not an educated group, no matter what economic class you're in, we're going to be a weaker nation. So this is extremely important for us to get on board and make sure children are educated. Okay, retained students are more likely to have poorer educational and employment outcomes during their late adolescence and early adulthood. So this is going beyond school. Education has an impact on a person's life. Retention is more likely to have benign or positive impact when students are not simply held back, but receive specific remediation to address skill and or behavior problems and promote achievement and social skills. Okay, so as you can see, there's more cons than there are pros. And it's controversial because some of the studies show that some of the cons are not real. I happen to think that they are. I have seen the impact in the classroom over decades. Now, what happens if you as a teacher have to give a retention letter or have a retention meeting? Sometimes they call them progress meetings, academic progress meetings, or as a parent and a family, you receive a letter from an educator about retention, or you have to have this academic progress meeting and then you find out your child is slated to be retained. Okay, first, you need to know in what areas does a child struggle most. Is it reading? Is it writing? Is it math, science, social studies? Is it just one subject? Is it multiple subjects? Is it all of them? Those are things that you need to consider. Because if it's one subject, if it's just reading, you can focus on that and then that's going to transcend into the other areas. Is there a disconnect between their reading and writing? Okay, so that's going to tell you what you're going to need to focus on. Okay, what have you and teachers done this year to help your child develop necessary skills? So this is extremely important. There's things that needs to be done in the classroom and there's things that need to be done at home in order for students not to fall in this trap. And you know, some educators will say, well, you know, Johnny doesn't do X, Y, and Z when I tell him X, Y, and Z. It's all about skill and strategy and what you do in the classroom to help Johnny do X, Y, and Z. Every situation is different, but I've seen so many different things that are implemented in the classroom that can avoid this happening. Okay? What has worked and helped your child learn? What hasn't worked this year? So keeping track in terms of what is beneficial for a student and mimicking that more often than not to make sure that he or she is on a successful track. If your child were to spend another year in the same grade, what type of instruction will she or he receive in the areas she or he finds most difficult? Would a new teaching approach or new materials be used? Or would it be the teacher doing the same thing as last year? How do you know that doing it over again would make a difference? This is extremely important to consider. Teachers and families. So when you're thinking that Johnny needs to be able to read on grade level and he needs to increase his math fact fluency in order to be on grade level, but if he comes back and he does the same work and he does the same type of assignments, is that going to improve when it didn't work this particular year? So you have to consider where he or she is going to go the next year. Now, this is the most important part. What have you, in terms of the families and the teachers, done this year to help your child develop the necessary skills? This is the most important component. Strategies within the classroom, strategies to take home can help put your child over the hump and save them from retention. Okay, next. What level of performance would you set for your child to achieve if he or she were retained? So you got to have, if you're even considering retention for the next year, what are the goals for that student so that it's not just punitive? Okay, what changes would you need to see to be satisfied that retention would be an effective option? Realistically, will your child be able to meet the required standards to be promoted the next year? So if Johnny or Betsy comes back and they do the same thing, maybe they see a little bit of increase, the work is a little bit easier because they've had it before. Would they be able to naturally be promoted to the next grade? Because otherwise, you're just going to have another social promotion. So a lot of people don't like, if they don't live up to these standards, they don't like bringing them to the next grade because they're calling it a social promotion. But then they don't want to retain them 2 years in a row either. So if what you plan for next year, if there is a plan, does not work, then you're going to have a social promotion anyways, and then you're going to have all that negativity within that child. So you have to consider these things. And this is key. Our arrow is a little bit off, but it's behavior concern. Like I said, by definition, retention is punitive. And it's a power that some educators have. And it's a power that educators can dangle over students' heads. I have seen it on all grade levels. Okay? So if it is based upon behavior, there has to be other discussions that needs to be held. How will your child feel about being retained? You need to know that. No matter what they say, look at them. Observe their body language. Observe their eye contact. Observe their tone when they're talking about it. Will he or she be more motivated to learn and try, or will she or he be embarrassed and further withdraw from learning? So again, this goes with the cons. The cons are many students who are retained, their self-esteem and their connection to education goes down to 2. So you really need to see if your child is motivated or if they're embarrassed and are going to withdraw from learning. What will happen to your child's peer supports and friends? How will they be affected by the retention? So typically in elementary school, middle school, high school, we have our core group of friends. They're typically usually within our grade. We go to birthday parties because they pass out the invitations in the classroom, and then your child is left behind, and they're leaving behind their peer supports, their friendships. So this is extremely key. And then what will happen to your child's peer supports and friendships? So typically in elementary school, we follow a particular grade. We get invitations to parties and celebrations in that grade. We do things outside of school based upon that grade group. And then if a child is retained, what happens to that peer support system that they've built? What happened to those friendships? They are no longer concentrated in that grade, doing activities within the school with that grade, and now they have to make friends in a whole nother grade while feeling the pressures and the shame of not having been smart enough in order to make the grade, if that makes sense. Okay, now next, your next steps as a teacher or as a parent. You need to use the child's school records to really determine where things went left if you don't already know. Okay? Let that data guide you. Go through the data and the school's district policy on retention and see what can be done with using both of those factors. Track when and where the challenges happened. Consider, is there any other solutions to the challenges? Now, with a lot of recent data on retention, a lot of schools have put things in place automatically. Some of them are in place, but they're not used school-wide. They're not advertised, but they're there. So sometimes you have to shake the tree a little bit to get the fruits and see if the school has, of course, most schools do in some grades, summer school. Another option is alternative assessments or coursework. And a lot of schools have bought online modules, and on these online modules, they will do the coursework in which they have failed, and so they can specifically hone in on specific subjects and specific units and specific skills that the child is going to need to master or gain proficiency in order to pass. Then you're going to meet with the school's administration and or teachers, whatever their setup is. And if that school already has a retention plan and they're not straying from that, it's their way or the highway, you need to have a plan B. Okay, as an educator or as a parent, you need to have a plan B. If you feel as though your child needs to be retained and they're not for it, or if you think that your child should not be retained and they're not trying to hear that, you need to come up with another plan. Now, if this is like too much for you, you have your plate full, we'll be more than welcome to help you, because here at Little Pro Education Group, this is what we are about: helping families, helping teachers in order to help children. So give us a call. I'm Randa, the lead consultant at Little Pro Education Group. Don't forget to comment below, like our video, comment below. Have you ever been retained? Do you know of a child who has been retained? Did it help? Did it hurt? What were the long-term effects? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget, we have a raffle. Join our Facebook group Like, subscribe, and comment, and you will be added to the raffle. $100 gift card. See you in the comments.